There is a particular kind of loss that has no name. Not the loss of a person, not the loss of a home or a position or a relationship, but the loss of who you are in a room, of where you stand in the shape of a family, of a quiet, daily acknowledgement that you are the one who is consulted, who is turned to, who holds the thread that keeps everything connected. The loss of that is what I am going to tell you about. My name is Irene. I'm 72 years old. And for 44 years of my life, I sat at the head of our dining table. Not because anyone assigned me that seat, not because there was a rule, but because in our family, that was simply where I sat. It was where I had always sat. It was understood. It was the same way it is understood that the sun rises in the east. Not because someone decided it should, but because that is how things are. I sat there when my children were small and the table was chaos and beautiful. I sat there through every Sunday lunch that Bernard and I ever made together. I sat there through the Christmases and the Easters and the birthdays and the ordinary Tuesdays that are the real substance of a life. I sat there when my husband's chair beside me became empty, and I sat there alone, and I kept sitting there because I was still the center. I was still the one the family turned to. I was still the anchor. And then, one Sunday afternoon, I walked into the dining room and Diane was in my chair. She was not doing anything dramatic. She was not making a statement. She was just sitting there, talking to Michael about something, her back to me, completely unaware that I was in the doorway. And it was just a chair, wood and cushion and 4 legs. Just a chair. But it was not just a chair. I stood in that doorway for a moment. I felt something move through me that I could not quite name. Something between a chill and a recognition. Like when you see something coming that you have been sensing for a long time, but have not quite formed into a clear thought. I turned around. I walked to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I stood at the counter and waited for the water to boil, and I thought about Bernard. I thought about the first time he pulled that chair out for me at our very first dinner party in our very first house, many decades ago, and said, "You sit here. You're the one who will hold this table together." And I had laughed and told him he was being silly. He was not being silly. He rarely was. About things that mattered. That Sunday afternoon was the beginning. Or rather, I understand now. It was not the beginning at all. It was just the moment I finally noticed what had already been happening for quite some time. Let me tell you the whole of it. All the way from the beginning. I grew up in a house where the woman ran things. Not in any dramatic or political sense. Simply in the way that families often work when you look honestly at them. The practical, daily running of a household. The organizing of people and schedules and needs. The holding of all the information that keeps a family functioning falls to someone. In our house, it fell to my mother. and my mother was very good at it. She was not a woman who needed credit for what she did. She did not stand at the head of the table and make speeches. She simply knew everything that was needed and made sure it happened. And the family ran the way the house ran. Smoothly, warmly, without anyone quite noticing how much effort had gone into the smoothness and warmth. I learned that from her. Not as a lesson. By observation. By being in the room while she did it. For 20 years. Before I started my own family and began doing it myself. I met Bernard when I was 26. He was 30. He was a quiet, steady man. An engineer by training and by temperament, which means he thought in systems and structures and was happiest when things were working the way they were designed to work. He applied this thinking not only to bridges and buildings but also to people, which made him an unusually perceptive husband and father. We married in 1978. We moved into a small house and then, when the children came, into a larger one. The house I still live in now. Bernard chose it because of the dining room. I remember him standing in that room on the viewing day, measuring it with his eyes the way engineers measure things, and saying, "This room is big enough for the family we are going to have." At the time, we had one child and were hoping for another. He had already decided on the family. He had already measured the room for it. The dining room had a long oak table that came with the house. The previous owners had left it, too large to move easily, and we had been glad. It seated 8 comfortably, 10 at a push. It was solid and plain and beautiful in the way that things made to last are beautiful. And at the head of it, Bernard placed a chair that was slightly different from the others, slightly taller, slightly more upright. A chair that had belonged to his mother and which he had brought from his parents' home after she passed. He placed it at the head and he said, "That's yours." I said, "Shouldn't the head chair be yours?" He said, "I'll sit beside you. But the head is yours. You're the one who will hold this table together." That was Bernard. He said things like that simply and without ceremony. The way he said everything important, as though it were a fact rather than a sentiment. And because it was said so plainly, without drama, it went in somewhere deep and stayed. We had 2 children. Michael came first, in 1979. Christine followed in 1982. They grew up at that table. They did everything children do at tables. Fought over the last bread roll. Spilled things. Grew gradually taller until they were eye level with me and then taller still. They brought their friends home. They brought their worries home. They brought their first loves home. Eventually, this Sunday lunch, which in our family was the equivalent of a formal introduction. Bernard sat to my right at every single one of those meals. Always to my right. Not at the head. Beside me. Close enough to reach my hand across the table if he needed to. Close enough to catch my eye when one of the children said something funny. He never tried to take the head. He never wanted it. He used to say that the family had a captain and he was glad not to be it. He said that for 41 years. And then he died. And I sat at the head alone. And I understood fully for the first time what it cost to hold something together. Because doing it with Bernard beside you and doing it without him are two entirely different things. Well, Bernard passed on a Wednesday in March. Quietly and without fuss, the way he had lived. He had been ill for 2 years. A slow illness, the kind that gives you time to say what needs saying, which is both a mercy and its own particular cruelty. We said everything. We had 41 years of practice of saying things honestly, and we used all of it in those 2 years. By the end, there was nothing left unsaid between us. And that, I have come to understand, is a rare and precious thing. Michael was devastated. He had been close to his father in the way that sons who understand their fathers are close. Not always expressive, but deeply rooted. After Bernard died, Michael came to the house every weekend without fail. He helped with the practical things. The boiler, the garden, the accounts, the endless paperwork that follows a death. He sat with me in the evenings and we talked, or we did not talk, and both were fine. Christine was further away. She had married and settled in another city, but she called every day and visited when she could. She had her father's directness and she used it. She said, at Christmas, 6 months after Bernard died, "Mom, are you going to be all right in that house alone?" "It's very big for one person," I said. "I have been in this house for 40 years. I know every creak in it." "I am perfectly all right," she said. "Good. But call me if you're not," I said. "You'll be the first person I call." She was satisfied with that. Christine, unlike Michael, did not feel the need to hover. She trusted me to say what I needed. In some ways, she was more like Bernard than Michael was. Michael was the one who worried. He came every weekend and he watched me and he thought about things, and eventually, about 18 months after Bernard died, he came to me with a proposal. He and Diane, he said, had been thinking. The house was too large for one person. Their flat was getting small for a growing family. Ella was 8 then. Noah was 5. And they needed more space. It made financial sense. It made practical sense. And he would feel better, he said, knowing I was not on my own. I listened to him. I thought about it carefully, the way I think about everything carefully. And then I said yes. Because Michael was my son and he worried about me. And his worrying was love. And I did not want to be the cause of unnecessary worry. And because the house was large. And because the evenings were long. I asked one thing of him. I said, "Michael, before you and Diane decide anything about this house, about how it runs, about how things are done, I want us to talk. the three of us, openly, about how this will work. He said, "Of course, Mom, we did have that conversation. All three of us, around the dining table. And it was honest and it was thorough, and we agreed on various things. We agreed that this was still my home and that I would still run my household in a way I always had. We agreed that Diane would take over certain things, the shopping, some of the cooking, because she was younger and it made sense and I was grateful for the help. We agreed that the children would respect the house and respect me, and that Michael and Diane would make sure of it. We agreed on many things that afternoon, and I believed, sitting at the head of that table with Michael to my right and Diane across from me, that the agreement would hold. I was not entirely wrong, and I was not entirely right. Diane was efficient. There is no other word for it, and I mean it without judgment. Or at least, without the judgment it might sound like. She was efficient the way well-designed machinery is efficient. She moved through tasks quickly and completely. She organized things without being asked. She made decisions without hesitation. These are not bad qualities. In many situations, they are admirable qualities. But efficiency, when applied to a family rather than a task, can miss things, can flatten things, can move past the texture of things in the interest of getting them done. She took over the running of the household within 3 months of moving in. Not dramatically. Not in one sudden declaration, but gradually, task by task, until one day I looked up and realized that the household was running according to her rhythms and her preferences and her systems, and I was moving within those systems rather than shaping them. The shopping was hers. The weekly menu was hers. The decisions about when the house was cleaned and how and by whom were hers. This was all practical and reasonable, and I had agreed to it. I reminded myself of that when I felt the first edges of discomfort. We had agreed. But then there were the other things. The things we had not specifically discussed. Because you cannot specifically discuss everything. The territory of a family is too large and too textured to agree on in advance. There are always the things that fall between the agreements. The first thing I noticed was the Sunday lunches. Sunday lunch had always been mine. For 44 years, I had made Sunday lunch. It was my day, my meal, my expression of the particular love I had for feeding people properly and sitting down together and being a family. Bernard had always helped. He was not a man who sat in the living room while his wife cooked alone. But the Sunday lunch was mine in the way that something can belong to a person without a formal agreement. Diane began, in the 3rd or 4th month of living together, to take over the Sunday lunch. Gradually, the way everything happened with Diane. Gradually and efficiently, with reasons that were always sensible. She would say, "I've started the potatoes. Irene, you should sit down." Or, "I've done the gravy already. It's all in hand, or simply, by the time I came downstairs on a Sunday morning, the cooking would already be underway and the kitchen would be organized around her work rather than mine. I appreciated the help. I told myself I appreciated the help. I was 71. My knees were not what they had been. Having someone else carry some of the Sunday cooking was not something I needed to resist. But by the 6th month, Sunday lunch was entirely hers. And I sat in the living room on Sunday mornings and waited to be called to the table. And there was something in that waiting, something in the shift from maker to guest at my own Sunday table, that sat uneasily inside me, even when I could not quite justify why. The second thing was the chair. Diane began sitting at the head of the table. Not in the first month, not even in the first 6. But over time, gradually, her seat at the table had migrated from the middle, where she had sat when she first came, toward the head. I noticed it happening the way you notice a slow tide. Not all at once. Just one day you look up and the water is higher than it was. The first time she sat in my chair, Bernard's mother's chair, the one he had said was mine, she may not have fully thought about what she was doing. She arrived at the table before me one Sunday and sat down, and everyone else sat down around her, and by the time I came from the kitchen, the seating was set. I took a chair at the side. I said nothing. The second time, I was already at the table, and Diane came from the kitchen carrying a dish and sat down in my chair as though she had always sat there, as though it were simply her chair now. I looked at Michael. He was looking at the table. He was not going to say anything. I could see that very clearly. I said nothing, but something inside me registered it. The way your body registers a change in temperature before your mind quite catches up. The third thing, and this is the hardest to describe, because it was not one action but an atmosphere, was the shift in who the family turned to. It happened slowly. When Ella had a problem at school, she used to come to me with it. She is a serious child. Ella, with a particular sensitivity of children who feel everything at a level their young faces cannot quite express. She used to come to my room in the evenings and sit with me and tell me things, and I would listen, and we would talk, and she would go to bed settled in a way she had not been settled when she arrived. That was our pattern. But as the months passed, she started going to her mother first, which is natural. Diane is her mother. But then she stopped coming to me at all. Not because she did not love me, but because Diane was the one who knew what was happening in her life now. Diane was the one at the school meetings, at the after-school pickup, at the center of Ella's daily life. And I was. What? I was the grandmother who sat in the living room and waited. When there were decisions to be made about the house, a repair needed, a change in the garden, what to do about the room that had been Michael's as a boy and was now a sort of unused space, Diane and Michael discussed them. Not with me, between themselves. And then they would tell me what had been decided, in the warm, informational way that you tell a child what is happening. Here's what we have decided. We thought you would want to know. I had agreed that they would make decisions together. I had agreed that this was their home too. But somehow the practice of it felt different from the idea of it. Because the idea of it was that we would all be part of things. The practice of it was that they were part of things. And I was informed of things. And those are not the same. And presiding over all of it, every Sunday, every family meal, every dinner when people gathered, was Diane, at the head of the table, in my chair. Agnes, my neighbor of 30 years, noticed before I had fully admitted it to myself. Agnes is the kind of friend who has known you long enough that she can say what she sees without you taking offense. She came for tea one Tuesday afternoon and we sat in the garden and she asked how things were with Michael and Diane living in. I said, "Diane, adjustment. It takes time." She said, "Irene, are you still running your own home?" I looked at her. She said, "I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because when I came in just now, you asked Diane if it was all right to make tea. You asked her. In your own kitchen." I thought about that. I had asked. I had walked into the kitchen and Diane was at the counter and I had said, "Agnes is here. Is it all right if I make us some tea?" And Diane had said, "Of course, Irene." Help yourself in the pleasant, generous way she had. And I had not even heard what I was doing until Agnes named it. I said to Agnes, "I suppose things have shifted a bit." She looked at me the way she has looked at me for 30 years. The particular look that means she is about to say something true that I may not want to hear. She said, "Irene, Bernard would have something to say about this." I said, "Bernard is not here to say anything," she said. "No, but you are." It was Noah's birthday that broke something open in me. Noah was turning 7. And in the family I had built and run for over 40 years, birthdays were always the same. The birthday person chose the meal. There were candles. There were songs. And there was a moment, before the cake was cut, where I would tell a story about the birthday child, about the day they were born or the first thing that made me laugh or the quality in them that I loved most and wanted them to know I had noticed. I had done it for Michael and Christine when they were growing up. I had done it for Ella every year since she was old enough to understand. And I had started doing it for Noah from his very first birthday. It was not a formal thing. No one had decided on it. It had simply become part of the birthday because I had done it once and the children had loved it, and so it continued. The way things become traditions, not by design, but by repetition and by meaning. Noah's 7th birthday was on a Saturday. The house was full. Michael and Diane and the children, and Christine, who had come down specially, and Christine's husband Paul, and Agnes, and a couple of Michael and Diane's friends who I did not know well. The dining room was decorated. The long table was extended. There was a cake that Diane had spent 2 days making, which was elaborate and beautiful and more than anything I would have managed, and I told her so and meant it. Dinner was warm and loud in the way that a house full of people who like each other is warm and loud. Noah sat at the table with the expression of a child who knows the evening is in his honor and intends to enjoy every second of it. Christine and I had spent part of the afternoon together, just the two of us, the way we always tried to grab some time when she visited, and it had been good for me, better than I had realized I needed. And then the cake came out, and everyone sang, and Noah blew out 7 candles. The first time, in 2 attempts, which he announced with great satisfaction, and the room was full of clapping. And then, Diane stood up. She was still at the head of the table. My chair, Bernard's mother's chair, and she was flushed from the cooking and from the warmth of the room and clearly full of happiness. And she said, "Before we cut the cake, I want to say a few words about this wonderful boy." And she told a story about Noah. A lovely story, warm and funny and full of detail only his mother would know. The room listened and laughed, and Noah went slightly pink with pleasure. And I sat at the side of the table, and I said nothing. Because what could I say? She was his mother. She had every right to say words about her son at his birthday. Of course she did. Everything she said was right. Every word of it was love. But I sat at the side of the table in a chair that was not mine, in a space that had gradually become less mine, and I listened to someone else fill the role that had always been mine. And something in me that had been holding very steady for a very long time simply released. Not loudly, not dramatically. I did not cry at the table. I would not do that. I sat and I listened and I smiled in the right places and I clapped when everyone else clapped. But inside, in that deep quiet place where the things that are true live, something had broken open. Christine noticed. Christine always notices, the way she has always noticed, quietly and completely, without making a fuss of it. She caught my eye across the table at one point, and she held it for just a moment, and I saw in her face that she understood exactly what was happening in mine. After the cake was cut and the children had been taken to bed and the guests had gone and Michael had fallen asleep on the sofa, Christine found me in the kitchen. I was washing up. Not because anyone needed me to, but because washing up is something to do with your hands when you are feeling something you have not yet decided how to feel. She came in and she picked up a dish towel and she stood beside me and she said, "Tell me," I said. "I'm fine," she said. "Mom." "Tell me." So I told her. I told her about the chair. I told her about the Sunday lunches. I told her about the decisions made between Diane and Michael and presented to me afterward. I told her about asking permission to make tea for Agnes in my own kitchen. I told her about the story at the birthday, not with blame, not saying Diane had done anything wrong, because she had not done anything wrong, not exactly, but saying how it had felt to sit at the side and watch someone else stand at the head and do the thing that had always been mine to do. Christine listened to all of it without interrupting. She dried dishes slowly and she listened. And when I finished, she set down the dish towel and she turned to face me. She said, "Mom, how long has this been happening?" I said. "A while," she said. "How long is a while?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Almost since they moved in small ways. It got bigger as it went along." She said, "And you didn't say anything." I said, "I didn't want to make trouble." She said, and this is Christine at her most like Bernard, her most plainly honest. She said, "Mom, you are not making trouble by existing in your own life. You are not making trouble by being who you are in your own family. The trouble is not coming from you." I said, "Diane doesn't mean any harm." "Christine," she said, "I believe you. But meaning no harm and doing no harm are two different things." I was quiet for a moment. Christine said, "Dad put you at the head of the table for a reason, not just as a seating arrangement. He put you there because you were the center of this family. You held us together. You still hold us together. And something is very wrong if you are at the side of your own table, at your own grandchild's birthday, feeling like a guest." I looked at my daughter. She had her father's eyes and her father's directness, and I loved her completely in that moment. I said, "What would you have me do?" She said, "Talk to Michael." Not to Diane first. To Michael. He is your son and he is in that house and he has been watching this happen and he needs to know that you have seen it. I said, "You will feel caught," she said. "He is already caught, Mom. He just hasn't admitted it to himself." I thought about that for a long time after Christine went to bed. I lay awake in the small hours and I thought about Bernard. I thought about what he had meant when he said the head of the table was mine. He had not meant only the chair. He had meant the role, the centrality, the being turned to. He had meant, "You are the one this family comes back to. You are the fixed point." And I had been that point for over 4 decades. And I thought about what happens when a fixed point begins to move. When the thing the family has always oriented by starts to drift. The family does not immediately notice. They adjust, without knowing they are adjusting. They find a new orientation. And by the time anyone looks up, the old fixed point is somewhere else entirely. And nobody quite knows how it got there. The next morning, a Sunday, I got up before anyone else. I went downstairs. I walked into the dining room. I looked at the table, and I did something that I had not done in a long time. I pulled out the chair at the head, Bernard's mother's chair. the one he had placed there decades ago and said was mine. I pulled it out. I sat in it. I sat with my hands on the table in front of me, and I looked down the length of the table. The long oak table that had held 40 years of family. And I breathed. In and out. Slowly. The way you breathe when you are returning to something. And I was still sitting there when Michael came downstairs. Michael stopped when he saw me. He stood in the doorway in his dressing gown, and he looked at me sitting at the head of the table, and I watched something move across his face. Something complicated. Something that was partly surprise and partly recognition and partly, I think, relief. As though some part of him had been waiting for exactly this moment, had known it was coming, had been both dreading and eating it. He came in. He sat down to my right, the way his father had always sat. To my right. I do not know if he chose it consciously, but he chose it. We sat in silence for a moment. The morning light came through the bay window and fell across the table the way it always had, the way it had fallen on this table for decades. I said, "I need to talk to you." "Michael," he said. "I know," I said. "You know," he said, "I've known for a while that something needed to be said. I've been waiting for you to say it." He looked at his hands. Or telling myself I was waiting for you, when really I think I was just hoping it would resolve itself without anyone having to say it. I said, "It doesn't resolve itself. Things like this don't resolve themselves. They just get heavier," he said. "I know," he paused. "Tell me what you need to say." "Mom." So I told him. Quietly, clearly, with no blame and no bitterness. Only the plain truth of what had happened and how it had felt. The chair. The Sunday lunches. The decisions. The birthday. The asking of permission to make tea. I said all of it. And I said, at the end, I'm not angry with Diane. I want to be very clear about that. I believe she has done most of this without fully understanding what she was doing. But Michael, you have seen it. You have been in that room. And you have let it go on. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right. I have seen it." I said, "Why?" he said, and his voice was lower when he said this, "Because I didn't know how to stop it without it becoming a fight. And I don't want there to be a fight between you and Diane. Because I love you both and I couldn't see a way to address it that didn't end badly." I said, "So instead you let it address itself by me shrinking." He closed his eyes for a moment. He said, "Yes. And that was wrong. And I'm sorry." I said, "I don't want sorry, Michael. I want things to change." He looked up. I said, "I want to be in my family again. Not managed. not informed of things. Present. The way I have always been present. I want to sit at the head of this table because it is mine and because that means something. Not just as a seat, but as what it stands for. I looked at him steadily. And I want to tell the birthday stories. I want to be the grandmother who does that. I have been doing it since Ella was born, and it matters to me, and I want it back. Michael said. Yes, simply. Immediately. Yes, Mum. All of it. Yes, I said. You need to talk to Dan, he said. I will, I said. Not as a criticism of her. Not as an accusation. But honestly. The way your father would have talked about something like this. Directly. Kindly. With love and without softening the truth out of it. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, Dad always said you held this table together, I said. He did, he said. He was right, I said. Yes. He usually was. Michael talked to Diane that afternoon. I do not know exactly what was said. They were in the garden for a long time, the two of them, while I sat inside with a book that I was not really reading. The conversation went on longer than I expected. There were moments. I could see them from the window where the talking was intense. Not argued, not angry, but serious. The kind of conversation that goes into difficult places and stays there until it is done. Afterwards, Diane came to find me. She came to the sitting room and she sat down across from me. And she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Open in a way she was not usually open. Diane is a person who presents herself carefully. She has a composure that she carries everywhere. But at that moment, the composure was not entirely in place. She looked, for perhaps the first time, simply human. She said, Irene, Michael has been talking to me. I said. I know, she said. I want to say something to you. And I want to say it properly. So please let me finish before you respond. I said. Of course. She said. I moved into this house and I told myself I was making it work for everyone. Making it functional. Making it run smoothly. And I believed that. I genuinely believed that what I was doing was helping. She paused. But Michael helped me see something this afternoon. He helped me see that what I was actually doing, underneath the efficiency and the helping, was making myself the center of this family. And not because anyone had asked me to be. And not because I had any right to be. She stopped again. Because I wanted to be. I waited. She said, I grew up in a family where nobody was the center. Where nobody held things together. Where every meal was separate and every decision was separate and there was no gathering point. No place where we all came together and were a family in the fullest sense. She said it carefully, like someone reading something they have written and revised many times. And when I came here, I saw what you had built, this family, this table, this way of being together. And I wanted it. I wanted to be the one who made that. But instead of building it alongside you, I took it. Without meaning to. But I took it. The room was very quiet. I said, "That is an honest thing to say. And it tells me more about you than you may realize." She said, "I'm sorry, Irene. Genuinely. Not for coming into this house and wanting to make it my home. I think that is natural and right. But for not understanding the difference between making it my home and removing you from it." I looked at this woman, my son's wife, the mother of my grandchildren, a woman who had grown up without a center and had come into a family that had won and had, out of hunger, not malice, tried to take that center for her own. I said, "Diane, I want something from you." She said, "Tell me," I said. "I want you to learn what I know. Not to replace me, but alongside me. The Sunday lunches, the birthday stories, the way this family comes together around this table. I have spent 44 years learning how to hold a family. That knowledge is not a weapon, and it is not a territory to protect. It is something I can share, if you will let me share it, rather than taking it." She looked at me, and something shifted in her face. Something genuine and quiet and a little raw. She said, "I would like that," I said. "Then come into the kitchen with me on Sunday. We will make the lunch together, and I will show you some things." She nodded. I said, "And at Noah's next birthday, we will both tell stories. One from you and one from me. Because a boy is lucky to have two women who love him enough to do that." She looked down for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Irene." I said, "You are welcome. Now, shall we have some tea?" she said. "I'll put the kettle on," I said. "No, I will. You sit down." And the ghost of a smile crossed her face. And she sat down. Sunday came. I was in the kitchen from 9 o'clock in the morning. That is when I always begin the Sunday lunch. 9 o'clock. Radio 4 on in the background. The particular morning light in the kitchen that only comes on Sundays. Or perhaps it is only that I notice it on Sundays. At 9:30, I heard footsteps on the stairs. And then Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was not dressed for anything special. She had an apron in her hand. Her own apron. The one she usually wore when she cooked. He said, "Where do you need me?" I looked at her for a moment, and I felt something settle. A thing that had been slightly off its foundation for 2 years, gently easing back. I said, "Start with the vegetables. They need peeling, and I always do them first." She came to the counter beside me. She picked up the peeler. She started on the carrots, the way I had always started, Carrots first, then parsnips, then potatoes. We worked side by side, not talking constantly, sometimes in silence, which was easier than it had ever been between us. Sometimes talking about small things. The children, something Ella had said at school, what Michael was planting in the garden now that spring was coming. The ordinary talk of two women working in a kitchen. At one point I said, "The stock needs watching. Can you stir it every few minutes and make sure it doesn't catch?" She moved to the stove without being asked twice. At another point she said, "Should this go in now or later?" and held up a bunch of thyme. I said, "Now. And a little more than you think you need." She put it in. It was not a transformation. It was not a miracle. It was two women learning to share a kitchen. Slowly, carefully, with the particular negotiation that shared kitchens always require. But it was honest. And it was the beginning of something better than what we had had. When the lunch was ready, we brought it to the table together. The table was already set. 8 places. Christine and Paul had stayed an extra day, making the most of the long weekend. The full table. The full family. And at the head of the table, Bernard's mother's chair, the upright one, the slightly different one, was my place. I did not make an announcement. I did not stand at the door and wait for someone to notice. I simply came in with the serving dish and I went to my chair and I sat down. And nobody said anything, because nothing needed to be said. It was simply how things were, how they had always been. Michael looked at me from the chair to my right, his father's place. He caught my eye and he did not say a word, but in his face was something I recognized. Something like his father looking back at me. Settled. Relieved. Right. Ella said, as she was passing the bread. "Grandma Irene, will you tell us the story about when Dad got lost at the supermarket when he was 7? Michael groaned. The table laughed. I told the story. I have told it perhaps 30 times in my life and it is still funny every time. And Michael still goes slightly pink. And the children still laugh with the fullness that only children laugh with when they learn something wonderfully embarrassing about the parent. Christine caught my eye from across the table, and she gave me a look that was entirely hers. Warm and satisfied, and a little smug in the way that younger sisters are smug when things turn out the way they said they would. I looked back at her and raised one eyebrow. She pressed her lips together not to laugh. Noah said, with his mouth full of bread. "Grandma, will you tell one about me next?" I said. "Finish what's in your mouth first." "No." He chewed. He swallowed. He looked at me expectantly. And I told a story about Noel. I'm 72 years old. I still sit at the head of my table. Not every evening. Some evenings Diane and Michael have the table to themselves and I eat in the kitchen or the sitting room, and that is perfectly fine, because every family needs its own private space within the larger space of a shared home. But on Sundays, on birthdays, on Christmas and Easter, and all the days that are meant for gathering, I am at the head. I am in my chair. I am the center. Oh, and Diane is beside me. Not in opposition, not in competition, but genuinely beside me, learning what I know, bringing what she knows. The Sunday lunches have become a collaboration. She has taught me things too, flavors and techniques that I would not have come to on my own, and I am a better cook for them. The kitchen is both of ours. The table belongs to all of us. Noah had his birthday recently. He is 7 now, a lively and imaginative child who can talk about his current obsession. At the moment, it is something to do with planets. For as long as anyone will listen, and often a little longer than that. At his birthday, 2 stories were told before the cake. One from Diane, one from me. Noah listened to both with the expression of a child who understands that being loved by multiple people is the greatest luck there is. Ella is still quiet and serious and wonderful. She still comes to my room sometimes in the evenings. Not every evening. She is 10 now and has her own world, her own friends, her own preoccupations. But sometimes, and when she comes, she climbs into the chair by the window and she tells me the things she cannot quite tell anyone else. She is at the age when children begin to understand that the world is complicated, and that age is not comfortable. I try to be the kind of person she can bring that discomfort to. I think about Bernard. I think about him every day. In a continuous, quiet way, you think about someone who has been part of every room and every meal and every version of yourself you have ever been. I think about what he would make of how things are now. And I think he would say, in that plain way of his, that this is how it should be. That a family is not a fixed thing, but a growing thing. That new people who come into it bring their own needs and their own histories. And that the measure of a family is not whether it stays exactly as it was, but whether it stays honest and warm and willing to do the difficult work of making room. He would say that making room does not mean giving up your seat. It means pulling out a chair beside you. I learned something important in those 2 years of slowly disappearing from my own table. I learned it the hard way, which is the way you learn things that really go in. I learned that presence requires intention, that you cannot simply exist in a space and expect to remain fully real in it. You have to choose, every day, to be present. Not aggressively, not demandingly, but firmly, with the quiet, ambiguous firmness of a woman who knows who she is and where she sits. Because here is the truth about family. A family needs a center. It needs a place that does not shift, a person who holds the thread. A chair that means something beyond its function as a chair. Not because families cannot survive without it. They can, and they do. but they are diminished without it. They lose something essential, some quality of continuity and rootedness and belonging that cannot be manufactured and cannot be replaced once it is gone. I was that center for my family. Bernard knew it and named it. My children grew up in it. My grandchildren are growing up in it now. And for a time, I had allowed it to drift, had not fought for it when I should have, had stayed quiet when I should have spoken. That was my part in what happened, and I do not pretend otherwise. But I came back to my chair, and I sat in it, and I let that simple act be the thing it needed to be. A statement made without words, quietly and with dignity, that I was still here, still present, still the fixed point. The chair at the head of the table is mine. It was always mine. And Bernard was right. All those years ago, when he said I would hold this table together. I am still holding it. And some evenings, when the meal is done and the candles are low and the children have gone upstairs and Michael and Diane are in the kitchen cleaning up, sometimes laughing, sometimes talking quietly, sometimes both. I sit for a moment longer at the head of the table, just me, and the long oak table, and the chair that was Bernard's mother's, and the fading evening light through the bay window. And I put my hands flat on the table, and I feel the wood under my palms, cool and solid and real. The same wood that has held 40 years of family meals, of arguments resolved and celebrations marked, of ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary Christmases, of the full, messy, irreplaceable texture of a life lived among the people you love. And I say, the way I say things to Bernard when the house is quiet enough, I'm still here, love, still holding the table, and the evening light comes through the window, and the house is warm. And somewhere upstairs, Noah's talking about planets to anyone who will listen. And I am exactly where I am supposed to be.